Hello friends, and welcome back to another book review from me, your host Logan Albright. And today I'm going to talk about Stephen King's The Stand, this epic fantasy sci-fi horror that is 1,400 pages long in the Unabridged edition. So let's dive right into it. First of all, I should point out that there are two versions of The Stand. There is the version initially published, and there is the revised unabridged version, which he published later. He says in the introduction that his publisher wouldn't let him publish the unabridged version because it was too long and it was too expensive to produce, and he had to cut out like 400 pages of it. So the unabridged version available now is longer, and this is about 1,400 pages in paperback. It's already kind of beat up, as you can see, because it's hard to read a 1,400 page paperback that is as wide as it is thick without it falling apart a little bit. So I've mentioned before about how I've kind of had a love-hate relationship with Stephen King over the years. I was really into him as a young teenager. I read a lot of his stuff, and I really liked it. And then I became so angry at the terrible novel that is The Tommyknockers that I swore off of him for like 20 years. And I finally started coming back to him, and I'm happy to say that with The Stand, he has completely won me back over. I think it's the best thing that I've read by him. It's a great story, and it's kind of perfect reading for this time that we're in with this crazy pandemic and all this stuff, because The Stand is indeed about a pandemic that wipes out 99% of the world's population. One of the things I like about a long novel, something that takes a long time to get going, is that you have time to do lots of different things. You have time to develop your characters really interestingly. You have time for the story to change. Like this, by the time I got to the end of this novel, it was like a completely different book to the beginning. So much had happened, and so many things had gone on, and so many characters had come and gone, that it's this saga that goes on with, and by the time you finish it, it's a completely different group of people than when you started almost. I think that's really cool. The other thing I like that you can do in this is a trick that I always fall for, and I always love it, even though I've seen it a million times. It's something my favorite writer, Victor Hugo, does a lot, where you introduce something early on in the book, a little inconsequential element introduced early on, and then you forget about it. And you forget about it for 1,000 pages, and it's just gone. And then it comes back right at the end, and you're like, oh, I remember that from 1,000 pages ago. And that is such a thrilling sensation when that happens. It always gets me. I love when authors do that, and Stephen King does that here a couple times. I think it's a great trick, something that's, if you have a long book, you can give your audience time to forget what's happened. It's a great thing to do. The Stand is not primarily a horror novel, I would say. Stephen King is known as a horror writer, but most of this book is not especially scary. It kind of starts as almost a science fiction dystopia where a plague is released and people die off and people have to start rebuilding society. And it's just the story of these people and how they get along and what's going on. And so for most of the book, it's really not a horror novel. But towards the end, as it gets more into the story, it culminates into this epic battle of good and evil. And I think what Stephen King does really well is putting in these little droplets of just horrifying elements. He's good at kind of the unspeakable horror, the undefined horror, things that you don't really understand why they're scary, but they're scary. There's a few moments like that in here where I think he does a fantastic job of channeling fear and channeling kind of this nameless dread that's out there in the dark somewhere. His main antagonist in this is named Randall Flagg. He's been used as an antagonist in other Stephen King books, including in the Dark Tower series, which I read and reviewed. And he is sort of this embodiment of evil itself. And the thing that's so scary about him is how little we know about him and how mysterious his motivations are, and how subtle he can be. And I think that's great. And then there's other characters. There's a character called the Trash Can Man who's a serial arsonist, and I find him really scary because it's that irrational fascination with fire that I find really terrifying. It's like he knows it's bad for him. He knows he's going to endanger his own life and the lives of others by playing with fire, but he doesn't care because he's so driven by this addiction to this thrill of fire. That thing I found really scary as well. So there's a few moments in there that I think he does an excellent job of creating that fear atmosphere. But most of it is not really a horror novel. Most of it is more of a science fiction dystopia or a story about people. And one of the great things about long novels and epic novels, and I think the best novels, is that they can contain a little bit of everything. They contain all of life in them. They contain moral lessons and things about every aspect of life. There's love, there's death, there's relationships, there's redemption, there's fear, there's good, there's evil, there's dreams, there's ambition, hopes and aspirations. Every aspect of life that you can imagine is captured somewhere in this book in some way or another. There's jealousy, there's desire, there's envy. All the emotions that you can imagine are captured in here some way or another. And I think the best novels really do that, and that's what makes them makes us respond to them, is that they remind us of things in our own lives or in lives in other people's lives. Things we experience in the world are then captured and distilled, and they are brought together in a coherent way in the text of the novel. So like a lot of people think you can't really learn anything from fiction and that reading fiction is a waste of time because you should be reading nonfiction and learning stuff. But I disagree with that completely, because I think good fiction that is really evocative and is really well written and really well thought out, it teaches us a lot about life and we can learn a lot from it. And I think this book does that really well. Like I said, I think it's my favorite thing that King has done. I like it even better than the couple books in the Dark Tower series, which I cited as my favorite. I think book 2 and book 3 I said. I think this is even better than that because it's self-contained, and it's got great characters. I think the characters are really well drawn in here. They're very believable. They're a lot of different types of characters. It's not just one type. I think that's sort of the challenge with writing a main character, is like making them have their own characteristics and making them interesting and not just a generic protagonist who's there to drive the plot. And all the characters in here have their own motivations. They have their own weaknesses. They have their own strengths. And they all drive the plot differently by their different ways of reacting to circumstances. And I think he does a good job of creating different types of characters. And they're not really stock boilerplate characters either. A lot of people do that where they're like, well, here's the nerd scientist, and here's the jock guy, and here's the rude guy, and, here's the action military guy. And, he doesn't really do that. I mean, the characters that he puts in here are not super archetypes. They're more realistic. They're more real people. And they have frailties and failings, but they also have good points. And some you're going to like better than others. But I think they're very believable and well-crafted characters, which is very essential. If you're going to live with a character for 1,400 pages, it's important that you believe them and that you can sympathize with them. Speaking of characters, there's also more than one villain in this book. Randall Flagg, as I said, is the main villain, but there's like 3 or 4 other villains along the way, kind of minor bad guys, minor bosses, you might say. And I like that too, because you have this more complex web of antagonism that the heroes have to overcome. It's not just going after one guy. It's not just achieving one goal. There's obstacles thrown up in their faces in a lot of different ways by a lot of different types of bad guys who have different motivations and different capabilities. And I think that's good too. I started watching the miniseries from the 90s on this. It's not very good. But it's interesting to see the adaptation. The adaptation was directed, or not directed, but written by Stephen King as well. So it's fairly faithful to the book, but the acting is not very good. The effects are not very good. The direction is not very good. Doesn't really work. But the book itself, excellent. Highly recommend. So if you're looking for a little light pandemic reading and you want something that's going to be emotional and going to be relatable and going to be real and going to be gripping, a page turner, this is a great choice. I really like The Stand. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. It's a little slow to get going, as you might expect for something this long. It takes a while to build up to the real momentum of the story because you're introducing all the characters and setting the backdrop and figuring out what's happening. But once it gets going, it's a thrill ride, man. So I really do recommend it. I think The Stand is the best thing I've read by Stephen King, and I'll probably read more of his books in the future. I've read about 15 to 17 of his books, I think, and this is the best one. So there you have it. That's what I thought. It took me a long time to get through, so I appreciate you guys being patient with me and letting me review it for you. I hope you will enjoy it. Feel free to recommend in the comments if you have other Stephen King books that I need to read that I haven't read yet. I'd be happy to hear your recommendations. And like and subscribe as always. I want to be able to keep building more content like this for you and keep reading more books and keep recording videos for you guys. So like and subscribe, leave me comments down below. And before I forget, don't forget to pre-order a copy of my new book, Conform or Be Cast Out, The Literal Demonization of Nonconformists, coming out on December 1st officially. Please pre-order it if you intend to. It'll help me so much with sales rankings and visibility and advertising. The more people who pre-order it, it really drives up the rankings. The link is in the description to where you can pre-order it, and I would sure appreciate it. Have a good one. I'll catch you next time.